Greetings, boys and babes. It's the Magic Hour, a place where we navigate through life's peaks and valleys with all the vulnerability and shamelessness we can muster. With the help of world-class guests from all walks of life, we uncover new truths and valuable tools for manifesting our highest potential. I'm your host, Mercedes Terrell, along with my partner in shine, Jade Bryce.
Hey, you guys.
And I told you guys this at the top of the show, but we are doing things a little bit differently today. We've opened up this podcast here on Zoom to the attendees in our men's workshop, Awakening the King Within. So they are on live with us now, and we will have the opportunity to open it up to questions from them at the end of this episode, which means, guys, you listening, you kings listening, if you would hit the Q&A button, not the chat button, in order to submit your questions, we can find them at the end of the show. So Jade, tell us about our guest today.
Yes, so we are having on a man that not only has mentored one of my mentors and one of Mercedes' mentors, but also has mentored my partner. So basically, without even knowing him and without him even knowing it, he has changed my life through both of these people. He is a seminar presenter, storyteller, and teacher with a background in counseling, experiential psychotherapy, and personal and spiritual development. In addition to more than 35 years of experience as a healer, breathwork practitioner, and trainer, he has also been, for just as many years, engaged in a deep study of various systems of thought, from depth psychology, Jungian and Neo-Jungian sensibilities, various esoteric religious models, all the way to mythic and archetypal symbols. He synthesizes this vast knowledge into an easily understood, practical, and accessible framework. I am so excited for you guys to hear from him today. So with that, please help me welcome James Frazier to the show.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So James, as I said in your intro, you have mentored some people that are very close to me. And one of them had mentioned that there are 4 things you would really want your male clients to do. The 4 were, and you can correct me if I've misquoted this: recognize and heal their mother wound, learn their symbols, find their art form, and do shadow work. So we would love to just touch on each of these 4 things today on the show. If it's okay with you, I'd like to start with the mother wound. Maybe how we can recognize it. Yeah, and then start to heal it.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for that wonderful introduction. It's always a mixed blessing. You love to hear nice things said about yourself, but then you start wondering, am I going to live up to this? I do appreciate that. I'll be happy to jump right in. I guess I would ask for a differentiation, because normally I refer to this as the mother issue. No doubt there are lots of men who are wounded by their mother, just as there are lots of women who are wounded by their father. Some of those wounds are conscious and some unconscious. But the mother issue label reflects a much, much larger thing that we're dealing with, because we're not just dealing with the real life mother, although there's some very powerful things that need to occur around that, which are not occurring in the modern world. Notably, the separation at puberty that traditional cultures would have all insisted upon and would have facilitated with various ritual practices. We've not done that in the last 400 or 500 years, and I think that's creating huge amounts of problems in the psyche of males, as well as in our society in general. So when I talk about the mother issue, I'm not only talking about the real, live, actual physical mother. I'm talking about the archetype of the mother. I'm talking about the separation of a mother that needs to take place, a movement out of the world of boyhood into the world of true mature masculinity. And I'm also talking about things like the inner feminine, which is heavily colored by the mother's experience. And then I'm talking about the transference of that onto other real live women, often to disastrous effects. So it's a much bigger package than just, me and my actual literal mother. So I hope that kind of clears that up a little bit. This can even involve things like trauma of birth. And by the way, I should interject here, none of my work is ever about parent blaming. This is not about blaming mothers or claiming mothers are responsible for all the dysfunction we see in masculinity. if anything, if any blame were to be attached, that probably should go more toward the failure of men to help young men move into this masculine, mature expression.
Mhm.
But again, I'm not about. I find it very dissatisfactory to try to blame parents. Most parents do about the best they can. Most of them didn't get the blessing. They didn't get the initiations.
Yeah.
They're kind of limping along like everybody else. There are some, occasional cases where you have extreme dysfunctions and psychopathologies, but it's really not about mother blaming. So I hope nobody misunderstands me on that particular thing. But
Right. Thank you for clarifying.
yeah, we're all affected by birth. Birth is one of the most traumatic things we ever come through, and there's been tremendous amount of work in the last, particularly the last 40 years, about understanding the imprint that birth gives us, and even forms the lens through which we can be affected the rest of our life, because that's the lens we look at the world through. So I've done a lot of work around that particular aspect, particularly with the non-ordinary states of consciousness work that I do. But it's also all the different stages of childhood that we're supposed to be doing developmental processes, and whether those get completed or not, or whether they get damaged. Again, sometimes there is failure to separate from mother. In fact, quite frequently, I would argue, in the modern world, we're not really separating from mother, and thus we have a situation where there are a lot of men walking around in mature, 6 foot tall, 220-pound bodies, but they're still operating on the same psyche of a 12-year-old because they have not been helped through the developmental stages and processes that are needed for someone to come into a real mature expression of masculinity.
Yeah. Yes. I witnessed this.
And how would a man know if that is an active area he needs to look at, and maybe what would come from healing it?
Well, I think what happens for a lot of men is they begin to wake up to this about midlife.
Hmm.
We start off when we're in our 20s, we're kind of bulletproof. Society has told us all the things that we should do to be successful. We may buy into that more or less. And sometimes we have quite great success in the outer world, only to discover at midlife that something's wrong. There's we kind of go into flatland, if you will, where the things that worked maybe when we were in our 20s no longer work. Often there's a deepening sense of, is this all there is? Maybe I've attained success, or the opposite, I haven't attained success at all. And at midlife, I start really seriously questioning everything, including my relationships, my vocation, who I am as a person. And that's actually the beginning of what can be a very powerful initiatory time period. Um, and I'm using the word initiation in a broad sense to mean processes that truly can become effective enough that when you finish those processes, you wind up with a changed sense of self. Um, so very often it's midlife, or there's some crisis that happens prior to midlife. I certainly work with clients who are younger than midlife, but sometimes people will suffer a great loss. They lose a career, they get a disease, they lose a loved one, they lose a relationship. It's just usually some loss that throws them into this serious questioning of who they are, where they're going, what direction they're headed. And many of them find, I don't have the answers. And there's not very many places in our culture to look around because it's not a topic of popular conversation. We do all of our educational processes, for example, are mostly geared toward learning skills that will help you get a job. We almost do nothing to teach people how to do relationships. We don't teach about boundaries. We don't teach about conflict. We don't teach about um, being self-assertive, being authentic, being in integrity. We don't teach any of that. We just assume people are going to automatically get that when they turn 18. And of course, that's absolutely not the case. So usually it's life sort of catches up with you, and people are often thrown into this flatland place where they feel like there's something they need to be doing, but they're not quite sure what. And often it's, again, turning inward. Not that they need to abandon the outer world by any means, but it's a beginning to take into consideration the background of one's life, or what typically in depth psychology is referred to as the unconscious.
Mhm.
And this would involve, as we're probably, we'll talk some more about, shadow work, but it involves looking at what are the things that are affecting me profoundly affecting me that I have to this point had no awareness of. So it's a deep investigation of all the forces and things like complexes and belief systems and the programs that we took on from both our family of origin as well as culture in general, and a serious examination of how those affecting me. So a lot of the work that I do, particularly with men, although I work with women as well, in the same way, is trying to connect with deeper issues in the psyche that the person has been unconscious of, as well as connecting to deeper resources. So it's not just archaeological dig, if to use that metaphor, although that's important as well, but it's equally about a construction project. How do you build this second half of life, particularly? How do you do the inner work that allows you to connect with the resources which make you much more effective, both in your relationships, in the outer world, in dealing with boundaries, and ultimately reaching that place where you can become a very positive force in the world in terms of helping other people.
Yeah, and it's so beautiful that you are one of those people, and we get to have you here on the show who are giving men a roadmap and women a roadmap to get through this, because it is a process that we have very few resources for, and we really have, like you said, we have really no initiation processes, especially for men in our culture. Women, we have a period, we have this menstruation that starts, and that kind of helps kick us off into that realm, so to speak. But obviously we started a workshop on this because we felt like that was a place that was really lacking for the men in our lives growing up. And so we're glad to know you, James. And something you brought up that really aligns with something I was actually watching yesterday. I was watching a woman walk a man through getting into some trauma work, and the trauma work that you're talking about, or shadow work, let's call it here, and digging up these places in our unconscious that are wanting to be looked at, can go as deep as what you were talking about earlier, which is this birth trauma. I mean, as deep as in utero trauma, where that transition happens and we are now born into
and
this,
followed right after by circumcision.
Yeah, and we're born into this very uncomfortable situation. And then later in life, like you're saying, maybe midlife or maybe even sooner for some, but we have essentially a rebirth again, and there's some sort of almost traumatization that can occur again if we don't have someone to help guide us through it. And so one of the factors that you had listed there, or Jade had listed, was how men can learn their symbols as a way to begin walking through this work. So James, if you could, Jade and I are both somewhat familiar with symbolism and dream interpretation. I've been dream journaling for over a year now, like really consistently. And we've read some of Jung's work specifically on symbols and dreams, but I would love to get into the basics here with us and our listeners, and get into how an authority on this, in this realm like you, can help men look at that stuff, or where do they begin looking at their symbols or digging up what that even means in the first place.
Okay. Again, I would argue for a little more differentiation. Usually what I refer to this as learning to think symbolically. Might just as well substitute learning to think in metaphor. In other words, to be able to see one thing in another. And part of the problem in the modern world is that we're quite disconnected from symbolic thinking, in that we've gone down the road of a sort of uber rationality, beginning with first the Protestant Reformation rather, then the Scientific Revolution, then moving into the Age of Enlightenment, and then now the Scientific and Industrial Revolution, where we're quite distant from even the idea of symbolism. So we've moved into a quite epistemological criticism of symbolism. And that's partly because science, which has risen to like the ultimate place, and it's replaced religion actually in our culture as the ultimate authority. But in science, you cannot deal with symbolism. Things can only mean one thing in science. So for example, to take something as simple as water, the scientific notation for water is H2O, and it means one thing: two hydrogen atoms, one oxygen atom, that's it. It doesn't mean anything else. It cannot mean anything else. Now compare that to a bowl of water sitting on your counter. That bowl of water also means H2O, but it might remind you of a fishbowl you had when you were a child and your first pet you lost, which was the goldfish. It might remind you, if you can think even more symbolically, to something as far as big as the ocean, which is kind of a perfect metaphor for the unconscious.
Mm.
Most of us think of the unconscious at best, if we think of it at all, we generally think of the unconscious as like a giant file cabinet, everything's stored in there in manila folders. We don't think of it as it really is, which is living contents, just like our psyche is, our conscious mind is living, so too the unconscious. So the ocean is kind of this perfect metaphor, because when you look at the ocean, you generally don't see anything but the surface. Occasionally a fish will jump out, but normally you don't see the tremendous amount of life that's underneath the surface until you put on a diving suit, and then you go down, and then suddenly you're in this whole other world. So water could mean many, many different things. It could mean the ocean, the unconscious. It could symbolize tears and emotions, thus connected to feelings. So you can see how a symbol can point to a mystery that may ultimately be unsolvable in our scientific sense, particularly, but it can be multiple layered, whereas a sign means one thing. So we've moved away from symbolic thinking and thus metaphorical thinking, and we've much moved more and more toward literal thinking, which works wonderfully well with some things. If you're going to do science, that's where you want to be. But if you're going to be a human and you want to live, then opening up to the symbolic dimension, the metaphorical dimension, and thus being able to see the value in things like story and myth and fairy tales and movies, as how these could apply to the processes that are going on in the unconscious in one's own psyche, as opposed to just dead stories that, you know, some guys made up who were bored on a Friday night. It makes huge, huge difference. So I would argue for symbolic thinking as a way of kind of just opening up to even things like synchronicity, for example. There are a lot of people who have synchronicities and they just ignore them. They just go, oh, well, that was a coincidence, unless it's very overwhelming synchronicity. But if you start thinking symbolically, very often you'll be able to actually utilize that. The same is true with dreams. You know, so many people literalize dreams. They don't really have, they're not, they don't actually have an understanding of the symbolic nature of dreams. So if they dream of their friend, Joe, who's in, you know, in their real life, they have a friend named Joe, and they dream of Joe in the dream, they think the dream is about Joe, instead of thinking, well, what is Joe symbolizing in my conscious? Why is my unconscious using the symbol of Joe? So that's sort of what I mean by symbolic thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I just to bring in a personal story on that, because you brought up Joe. I have a girlfriend who, to me, she's always, you know, she's always getting way too intoxicated. I'm having to kind of take care of her. I'm the person who's more like, you know, 2 drinks max type of person, and she's like 2 sheets to the wind, you know, very quickly. So I'm trying to wrangle her all the time in real life. And she's a lovely person, and she's always crying. She's very in touch with her emotions very quickly. And I'm very much the opposite in a lot of ways. And that's been a struggle for me. So in my dreams, I realized that she actually represents this feminine quality, this chaos, this, you know, fluidity, this emotional being, and all these things. So when I can now see her, because she comes in my dreams often, so I knew it was a definite symbol I needed to be really looking at. And when I could recognize her as this feminine energy, I could see my interactions with her in the dream completely differently. Now they could guide me to whatever my dream was trying to show me. It was pretty groundbreaking to just uncover that one symbol.
Yeah. I also, for me, when someone shows up, that's been really key for me, is like, what do they represent for me? So like for a long time, I kept having dreams of Snoop Dogg and I started to ask myself, like, well, what does he represent to me? And to me, he's very silly. He's goofy. He's playful. He's like, you know, just such a goof. And so it was like my psyche asking me to embrace those parts of myself, the part that's playful, that will be goofy. And there was a time that like I had a dream that Mercedes was like kissing my neck and like whispering sweet things in my ear. And she's like a sister to me. So it was like so weird. But then I realized, you know, Mercedes to me represents logic and groundedness and centeredness. So it was like, that was my psyche trying to those parts of me trying to entice me to, have that exchange with them. Lately, I've been having dreams with random celebrities, and I'm trying to figure out what they represent. But my guess would be that their symbolism would be like the unknown, or, the fantasy, maybe I'm still digging in on that, but symbolism has been really useful. I also want to get into how important it is for men to find their art form. I'm not sure. So we already on the other two questions were a little bit misconstrued on what it meant. I'm not exactly sure if art form means, picking up the guitar, if it could be a martial art, or what exactly that means, but I'll let you describe before I assume.
Okay. Well, again, usually what I'd say is for men to do artwork.
Mm.
And I'm referring to particularly things like art journaling, or trying to connect with emotions inside and express them in some art form.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it is true that there are men that are going to resonate. There's some men who are terrified by looking at a white blank piece of paper. And often with those men, I'll have them try to do something that's more tactile, like clay work or mask making, or even painting objects like rocks, where the form is already there and you're just trying to express it. So it's the idea that through artwork, we are often able to express emotions in a way that we cannot in just English language. Language sort of tends to remove us one step from the art. And sometimes, particularly for men, we start off behind the eight ball in terms of this emotional stuff. Women are they're just gifted in talking about emotions. There's some people who would speculate that goes all the way back to the hunter-gatherer situation, where the men are out hunting and you don't talk because it scares all the game away, whereas the women are back at the cave, so to speak, raising their children and having conversations with each other. But it's deeper than that. I'm being a little slightly trying to make a joke with that, but the idea is that women are typically much better at expressing emotions and much more differentiated in their emotions. So you ask a woman how she's feeling, she might come up with one of 200 different emotions. And with some men, it's like you have trouble pulling out whether they're one of the four emotions, anger, sad, happy, glad. But that's partially also because the failure of particularly the puberty initiation, does not allow men to awaken to their masculine emotional body. If you get around men who have been initiated, their emotional body is quite awakened. They are quite capable of discussing emotions, and they are quite capable of expressing emotions and differentiating emotions. So it's partly this failure on the part of our culture to really initiate males into the masculine, awakened masculine body. But for many men, and women, if you'll do artwork in addition to your inner work, it just accelerates everything so much. And so I'm continually trying to push for that. It also helps connect you to the very fundamental part of our psyche, which has to do with creativity. And in some ways, when we're creative, we're the most godlike in one way.
We're bringing up our lover.
Well, I'm never suggesting that we try to be gods. We make terrible gods. Thus, you don't want to ever try to become an archetype, for example. But on the other hand, creativity is just a gift that we have that no other animal has. We have an opposable thumb. Thus, we're tool makers. We're also myth makers. We're storytellers. You drop us down anywhere on this planet, and we'll start telling stories. Now, I love my dogs, for example. My dogs have great capacity in the emotional dimension, but they have no creativity. They don't sit around discussing should they knock out this wall and should make a bigger dog house. So it is one of the things that is so distinguishing about us humans. And so I believe every human is supposed to be creative. And if you add creativity and artwork to your inner practice, it will accelerate it enormously.
Yeah. You said a man who's been initiated, and maybe you can give us an example of how a man can be initiated, since we have lost the sacred rituals for that.
Okay. Well, I almost need to go back and talk about a time before we had lost those to kind of give you an example of what this was like. Uh, you mentioned earlier, Mercedes, about women's initiations.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very convinced that many of the early man, pre-modern man, their attempts at initiating the male was, first of all, based upon what nature did to women. It doesn't take a caveman to make this, you don't have to be very bright to figure out that women's menstruation cycle, which is their onset of womanhood, it's the demonstrable nature act that they can now have children. That's cosmic in its nature because it's related to the cycle of the moon. They match exactly. So again, you wouldn't have to be brilliant to figure that out. And I also suspect that the moon is quite mysterious. It's like no other light in the sky. It grows bigger, it gets full, and then it starts dying. And this happens. So it's a perfect metaphor for birth and death.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if you lived on the ocean, you would know very quickly that it affects the tides. And we also have this apocryphal idea that in full moons, people are more emotional. So again, this is pretty ancient stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no equivalent cosmic initiation for males. I mean, a male getting pubic hair and the ability to ejaculate in sexual orgasm is not exactly cosmic. But if you study these ancient cultures, what you find is that very often the practices that they developed and the rituals that they developed mimicked what nature did to women. So you'll often have boys taken into caves, for example, left for 3 days. The caves in France, I truly believe the ones that have been discovered in this last century that are dated 35, 40,000 years ago with these magnificent animal paintings on them are truly stunning. But you can imagine boys being taken in there, left for 3 days with no light, no water, no food. You will go into a non-ordinary state of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It's just inevitable. And then suddenly you can imagine the shaman initiators lighting torches and suddenly illuminating the interior of that place. It would be like a second birth. It would be like you, and in that situation, there's a very strong possibility that you would have brought up material that was uncompleted from your actual birth.
Mm-hmm.
The circumcision that you mentioned earlier was never done at birth. It was always done at puberty, so that males had an equal genital wound. So much of what's happening is that they're copying nature, so to speak, but the realization that in the case of men, a much bigger intervention needed to take place. And if you did not go through that second birth, you really weren't quite human. And things would turn very demonic and toxic. This is coinciding, of course, when the young male is suddenly being flooded with a DNA testosterone agenda of aggression. And the idea was that if you did not steward that, that it would turn very, very bad very quickly. So the idea was that you were both put through a near-death experience, a confrontation with death. You had some kind of symbolic things such as scarification, a very frequent thing you'll see in ancient culture. So when you met somebody in the woods, you'd know whether they'd been initiated or not. They literally would have stripes on their arms, leftover vestiges of that, of the military uniforms we have today, which have stripes on the arms. That's actually where that comes from.
Wow.
But you would have been put through this initiatory process. And again, by our modern sensibilities, this is just incredibly primitive and horrific because usually some of the boys actually died in the process. And of course, to our modern sensibilities, this is just unbelievable. But their sense was that unless they were playing with death, it wasn't going to be strong enough to pull that boy out of the world of mother. Because the world of mother contains this euphoric memory going all the way back to in utero, where all of your needs are met. Your oxygen's being supplied, your food products are being supplied, your waste products are being eliminated. You are directly connected to the great mother goddess. You and she are one. You're floating in this warm oceanic fluid, protected from loud noises and extreme temperature changes. And literally happiness is kind of forced upon you. I don't know what your idea of bliss is, but that's mine. Powerful, powerful, euphoric. So these cultures understood that if you left a boy in that world of the mother, he would never mature and be able to face things like pain, predators, to act in a warrior function to protect the tribe. So that was like a giant electromagnet, if you will. It took a huge counterforce to pull a boy out of that. And in these cultures, if a boy survived it and he went on to go through the other stewardship around the warrior energy, from that day forward, nobody ever treated him as a boy. It was a clear cut. Before you went into the initiation, you were a boy. When you came out of it, you were a man. And in many of these cultures, their emphasis is not like our modern culture on rights. Their emphasis is on what are your obligations? What are your obligations as a man toward the tribe or the culture? So you would also, this is the time when you would have been introduced to the mythic stories, the religious sacred text, which generally were stories about what happened at the beginning, like the creation myths. Unlike me, I started getting this when I was probably a year old in nursery school at the Southern Baptist Church. They start indoctrinating you right away. Whereas in these traditional cultures, you would have never been told something as sacred as that story until you had been through the second birth. So there are a number of different things that coalesce together, including, and most importantly, perhaps, the stewardship of older unrelated males to guide this initiatory process. You would have been taken through the warrior initiation, which would have connected you in a very powerful and regulated way to the archetype of the warrior. Then you would have been allowed to marry, but you would have never allowed anybody to marry who had not gone through that initiation, because the odds of them turning violent were pretty great. So now what we have in the modern world is we quit doing all that, basically with the knighthood traditions, and even those, of course, were mostly aristocratic. But we decided we don't need to do all that. It's all mumbo jumbo. It's all primitive stuff from the past, and it's just not a necessary thing. And consequently, we think, well, boys are all warrior. Well, actually, they're not. They're boy warrior, and they're flooded with this energy, but they don't know what to do with it, and they don't know how to steward it. So, unfortunately, much of that gets channeled into the shadowy parts of our culture. Things like gangs, for example. Very frequently, the young boys join those gangs right at puberty. That's the time they know something's supposed to be happening. The gangs put them through an initiation. They know a lot more about initiation than our culture does. Unfortunately, it's an initiation into a cult of death, not one that's a cult of life that could protect the culture and is concerned about the boy's soul. But the shadowy parts of our culture, the Hells Angels, the mafia, these folks, elaborate initiatory processes, often involving death, but they are not, they're the opposite, again, kind of a cult of death.
So we see also in college culture, right, in fraternities and such, some sort of that happening. Do you think there are any kind of initiation processes that we have in place now in our culture that do some positive for a man?
There are some places in our culture where men are awakening to this. I would not put college hazing in this. I don't. That's kind of the plastic replicas of the bones of dinosaurs of ritual. It's very far removed from the real thing. And it's usually just kind of sadomasochistic acting out, basically, and it can be very dangerous. There are people killed every year doing this kind of stuff. But the real true initiation of attempting to help a boy or a girl come into their mature feminine and mature masculine with great consciousness and connecting them to a transpersonal sense, even a transpersonal center, is one of the fundamental things that's missing here. So then what happens is people either keep questing for that, but there's almost no place that really knows too much about all of this. Or if they're fortunate, they'll run across somebody who has studied this, does know about this, can act as a mentor in this case. There are some groups of men who are around the world, actually, who are attempting to awaken this. But initiation is one of those things that sort of goes in and out of cultural awareness. And even among psychotherapists, there are not very many who know about this process, at least that I've met. But it's one of the most critical pieces that I think we badly need to wake up to. So the more people we can get talking about this, thinking about this, that's the bad news. The good news is that in some sense, life will initiate you. And it's also possible to voluntarily go into these. Now, you don't have to go into the near death thing, but you can voluntarily seek out a guide, seek out someone, a mentor who can help you through these processes. We all go through these throughout life. They're not just at puberty. Originally, the anthropologists thought that that was the only initiation there were, but there are definitely initiations that are life cycle generated. There's one about 3.5 years of age, another one about 6, another one at puberty, another one around 21, another one around age 30, another one around 40, 42, and that just keeps going. Uh, I'm, I'm at an age where I'm approaching some of the latter ones, but I do believe it's possible for you to keep to be open to the fact that we're all supposed to be going through these major processes of change. Managing change is one of those difficult things that humans have to face. And simply, there are many things we know about initiation. One is that there is a structure to the container of initiation. And if that structure is not missing or is defective, then the initiations are usually aborted or failed. And we have a lot of this today, unfortunately, where people are kind of self-appointed gurus who are offering what appears to be sacred space, but they actually don't know anything about it, and they're not contained. And so they're, in a way, they're sort of like Harry Potter who sneaks into his master's room and grabs a wand and conjures up a spirit, and they don't know what to do with it. But there are some components of sacred space um, that either make the initiatory space liminal, which means healing, or liminoid, which means it looks like it should be healing, but it's actually not, or even worse, it's destructive. So this is not anything new. This has been going on forever. It has to do with the difficulties of the magician archetype, but there is increasing awareness of this, and I think many men, particularly and women as well, of course, hunger for this kind of knowledge. And so I've just been very, very blessed to be able to work in this area for the last 3 decades, and I think it's one of the most important things we can do for our own personal psychological and spiritual growth.
We agree wholeheartedly.
And I believe your mentor, one of your mentors at least, was Robert Moore, who wrote the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's so amazing. The workshop that we did last night with our men's group was on those 4 archetypes. So really cool to be able to have you on today following that.
Yeah. And James, I do want to dive into shadow work with you, because that's a really big one. And I want to make sure we are respecting your time here. So what does it look like for a man to enter shadow work?
Okay. Well, we can use shadow in 2 broad senses. One would be anything in the unconscious, meaning anything we're not aware of. For some people, even the idea of the unconscious is rather abstract, but I can pretty easily demonstrate that you have one. First of all, if you've ever driven down the freeway and you've been intensely thinking about some issue that's going on in your life, and suddenly you realize you haven't been driving for the last 15 minutes. Somebody's been driving, and typically it's your unconscious. You also will be able to demonstrate the unconscious very easily when you suddenly have outbursts of affect and emotion that are way over the top for what the situation calls for. And then the other place, of course, is in dream work. Every night your conscious mind goes to sleep. That's the definition of that state. And the unconscious now has a stage, and it creates these incredible movies. So it's pretty easy to demonstrate it, but becoming aware of it and trying to begin to investigate how it affects us in our daily life is the great shift from my point of view. So the shadow work is almost one of the most important things that I can think of in addition to this initiatory material, because the concept of shadow is that we carry within us rejected parts. Almost every position we take, we automatically create its opposite. And then, but the fact is, it's like we push them all down into the basement. We don't want to know about them because they may be incompatible with our own self-image. They may be, typically the first shadow begins to get created by the family of origin, where qualities that we have that might actually not be bad qualities, they might be very good qualities, are somehow shamed or rejected by the family. And then that gets extended to the culture. And of course, when we all go off to school, you learn very quickly what's cool and what's not cool. And the parts of you that aren't cool, you try to get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
So we wind up, Robert Bly used to use this wonderful metaphor. We put all the stuff in the bag that we drag behind us.
Hmm.
And so the bigger our light, the bigger our shadow is. And if we are not at some point, and again, it's usually midlife, people start turning around and trying to pull stuff back out of the bag again. Again, some of it is things that we just simply need to acknowledge that we have so that we don't act them out unconsciously. So if I have a particular quality, let's say I decide early in life, based upon my family of origin, based upon my own personality, that I'm going to be a nice guy. And I go out of my way to be just the nicest, most pleasant guy. I never say any bad words to anybody. Well, where's my aggression?
Mm-hmm.
It's turning into a really big, huge counterbalance inside my psyche. And then suddenly one day it'll come roaring out, and I've put my fist through the door,
Mm-hmm.
or I've thrown the teacup across the room and shattered it, or I'm yelling at my kids, or I'm kicking the cat. And then that recedes, and I go, oh my God, I can't let that out again. Look what that damage happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll start doing passive aggressive behaviors, and then I'll avoid conflict, and then I'll have my personality be quite inauthentic because I'm not connecting to anger. It would be far better if I learned how to do clean anger. If I'm given that modeling, even taught that as a class, it would be wonderful. But certainly if our family of origin said, look, anger is a natural emotion. Things in life are going to make you angry, but it's far better for you to directly convey that you're anger, to own the anger. And also in clean anger, you have the possibility of offering a solution. So instead of doing it passively aggressively or pretending I don't have it, I try to become more authentic and whole by saying, to a person who's made me angry, look, when you did this, it made me angry. And here's what I need you to do to make restitution.
Hmm.
Bake me a batch of chocolate chip cookies. We'll be fine. But that usually what happens is we get either repression or we get the extreme of it, which is rage. And rage by that point is not seeking any resolution. It's just seeking to hurt and damage.
Mm-hmm.
So when we get in touch with shadow work, we're beginning to become, if we can own that shadow, then we become more whole, less perfect. And our whole culture, even our main religion, is based upon an idea of perfection, which none of us can ever reach. And therefore, a lot of us develop a lot of shame and a lot of inner adversarial voice that continues to hit us with how we're not measuring up to the idea of perfection. So shadow work is very, very difficult. It's hard. It's owning things you think are not you at all. But the alternative is, if you do not do shadow work, the shadow will project itself out onto whoever has a hook that will hold it. And so, at the risk of misunderstanding, I'll use a political metaphor. Let's say I decide I'm going to be a really good card carrying Republican.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm dyed in the wool Republican. Well, all I've done is create a counterbalance on the other side, like a schoolyard teeter totter. I have the bigger Republican I become, the bigger the Democrat is, except I don't know that. And I just go along life thinking I'm only a Republican. And then along comes a Democrat with a Democrat hook, and my shadow Democrat jumps out on them, and I hate them and want to kill them. This is what James Joyce refers to as the nightmare of history. This is the whole of human history. If I have the right religion, yours, I need to kill you because you have a different one than I do.
Right.
Or your skin color is different than mine, you're bad. So when we do shadow work, we don't become the shadow, but we own that we have it. And thus we don't need to project it any longer. So then the charge comes off of all these other people that we were so judgmental and maybe hateful toward. So if I had one wish, it would be that everybody in the world do shadow work. So it would reduce the amount of pain in the world enormously. So it's a huge, huge subject. We could spend several hours talking about shadow work, but I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of at least why I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a great place for men to start doing that work?
Mm.
Well, many of my workshops are geared toward this, but all of my individual work is geared toward this. I do both work on the archetypal level. I do a lot of work on the archetypal level, but it also a lot of work on shadow, of just trying to help men seriously examine the background of their own personal unconscious, as well as things like the transpersonal unconscious, which includes the archetypes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to give you that information in just a second here, guys, if you're watching or listening to this now. So get pen and paper out for that.
Yeah.
So there are a few short questions, James, that we like to ask everyone who comes on the show. So we'll kind of wrap up with those, and then we'll hop into the Q&A session from the guests today. All right. So the first question is, if you could hug your younger self right now, what would you say?
I would say always run toward the fear.
Mm.
Mm.
How old were you?
I would love for somebody to tell me that when I was 3.5.
Hmm. If you could have the whole world read one book, which would it be?
I'm sorry, you
If
cut
you
out.
could have the whole world read one book, which would it be?
Now that's an almost impossible question.
I know. Everyone feels that way.
Okay. Off the top of my head, it would be Man and His Symbols.
Okay.
It was co-written by Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz and Joseph Henderson. It is a book later in Jung's life, and it was specifically written as a kind of an introduction to his work. But if you do buy it, make sure you buy the large hardcover edition, because the soft cover edition, the paperback, is terrible. It's hard to read, and it doesn't have the images.
Huh.
But that's a great introduction to Jung's work, and I guess that would be my secret hope, is to introduce people to Jungian thinking.
I'm about halfway through it.
Mm. All right. If you could whisper one phrase to everyone on the planet, what would it be?
You are important.
Mm.
Before we jump into the Q&A, what ways can people work with you, and how can they get in contact with you for that?
Okay. The easiest way is to go to my website, which is James Frazier. That's FRAZIER.com, jamesfrazier.com. There's a email box that you can send me an email, and then we can go from there.
Perfect.
Wonderful. Guys, I hope you do reach out to James, because I think this is a great place for you to start doing this work. I know that if you're here from our men's workshop, you are already entering a lot of this deep diving. So he is a great extension of that. If you are looking to go further, definitely hit him up. All right, James. So we're going to jump into the Q&A session. And I have a question here. It says, James, I think you said you should not attempt to become an archetype. What did you mean by that?
Oh boy, that's also a very big subject.
Mm-hmm.
I'm responding to the fact that occasionally I'll see people posting things in places like Facebook and other things, like saying, "What archetype are you?" And sort of giving the idea that, one, your small s self ego could even control something like an archetype, or worse, that you might want to identify with an archetype. Archetypes are beyond human level energies. They are energies that absolutely fuel our psyche, but they're grandiose, they're gigantic, and possession by an archetype always turns demonic. So when the whole, all of this work, ultimately, I think for many of us, comes down to, particularly with these 4 major archetypes that Robert Moore did so much work around and had the great good fortune of learning from, it's actually the little s human self that has to regulate these things. So regulating archetypal energy so that you can use it appropriately and not be flooded with it or possessed by it is actually the key. So much like a campfire, for example, if you build a campfire on a cold winter's night, you want to be optimal distance from the campfire to receive the warmth, but you don't want to jump into the campfire because it will consume you. You'll be burned up. You also don't want to be so far away that you freeze to death.
Mm-hmm.
So the optimal distance and regulation of archetypal energy is the key. If you get inflated in an archetype, it can take over you and your personality go right out the door. And I can give you many, many examples from history where that has happened, where it almost always turns demonic. So just for example, a person flooding with lover energy is very prone to being in the active side of this, which is addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get somebody who's flooding with lover energy, they may very well get addicted to some substance, which then completely destroys their life. Whereas we all need lover energy, but you don't want to be flooded with it or identified with it. This is true with the magician archetype. It's true with the warrior archetype. It's true with the king and queen archetype. You do not want to be an archetype. That's not, you want to, any more than you want to take your toaster down directly to the nuclear power plant and directly hook it into the reactor, because there won't be any toast, there won't be any toaster, and there won't be any you. You've got to have appropriate regulation, transformers, wiring to your house, switches, fuse panel. Then you can adequately plug in your toaster and get some toast. So in a similar way, these archetypes are kind of like that, to use that technological metaphor. They're like a nuclear power plant, and it's just not a desirable thing to become an archetype.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have another one. It says, what is a technique for specifically healing my mother wound, and how can I stop projecting it onto my partner?
Well, that's a really good one. Well, the first thing is you've got some awareness that you have it and that you are projecting. And so the hard work is then beginning to pull back the projection, of really realizing this is an internal thing that needs to be handled internally. So that's no mean feat, by the way. But if you can do that, then you can begin to actually deal with and look inside at what are all the dimensions of this. And as I said when we started, it's probably bigger than just your actual mother, but you can do things like journaling. It's a wonderful way to what I call circumambulation around something. You just keep journaling and writing as much as you can about your mother, about the experience of the mother. And then, again, this is generally better facilitated if you're working with someone, but if you're working on your own, trying to express some of the emotions that may come up with that in artwork can be quite helpful. And like all complexes, which again, generally the mother wound is kind of synonymous with negative mother complex. Like all complexes, you're wanting to try to get to a place where you know as much as you can about the archetype, or about, about the complex, and then you're wanting to try to build boundaries between you and that, so that I keep saying archetype, sorry, that complex, when it constellates, the time that it's taken over is less and less and less, and the time it takes you to get conscious of it is shorter and shorter and shorter, and then you developing defenses against allowing that to take over. In other words, to get to a place where you know you have that complex, and even if it constellates, you refuse to act it out. So getting conscious about the projection process is very, very important, and just trying to pull back that projection and saying it's both unfair to my partner, but also I don't want to keep doing that. And where I really need to work on this is an internal process, not out here.
Yeah.
So I have another one here. It says, what was one of your biggest takeaways from working with Robert Moore?
Blessing. Robert Moore blessed me enormously in so many different ways. The second thing, of course, is that this model opened up a doorway for me that I cannot even now reflect back and imagine what my life would have been like without it. His work is much more than just masculine psychology. He became famous as being a masculine psychologist. He actually published this book because of an incident he had when he was traveling in India, where the cab driver turned down one street and said to him, there are 7,000 prostitutes on this street, men, women, and children. You can buy any of them, do anything you want to with them. And it hit him like a cast iron frying pan. And when he got back to the University of Chicago and sitting in the committee meetings, doing all the drivel that goes on in committee meetings, and realizing the tremendous psychopathology that's in the world from the boy masculine, he decided to publish this several years earlier as a kind of a way to help men try to get some orientation about what some of the stuff was going on. And so it opened up the whole world for me about my own woundedness in the masculine, about my need to connect with the masculine, about the work I needed to do on warrior. And it's just simply the most effective model I've ever come across in all of my studies of different schools of psychology. It sounds very abstract at first, like archetypes, what are those things?
Yeah.
But actually it's the most practical thing I know of. You don't
Hmm.
have to be in psychotherapy 15 years to figure out what's wrong with you. You can take somebody who has never read a book on psychology, and within a couple of 3 sessions, they begin to grasp this model. And within 6 sessions, they're like, okay, self-identifying what they need to do. So it's a very,
Wow.
very effective model.
Just by learning which archetype they need to, which archetype's energy they need to work with and which one may be inflated.
Yes, and which
Wow.
they might be flooding in and then putting energy into the opposite. Generally, we'll have 2 of these more or less in our conscious and 2 more or less unconscious.
Hmm.
So the balancing act is usually working on the opposite energy. So if you're flooded with magician and you have too much magician, you're too
That's
detached,
me. Hmm.
too manipulating, or the passive side of it, denying innocence. Either one of those, you need to put more energy into the queen or the king archetype because that helps balance that out. Same is true with the lover and the warrior. And you can see this in addictions, for example, where a person is addicted to, say, something like alcohol, and they become chronic alcoholic, and they cannot set a boundary between them and the alcohol. They can't do like Mercedes was saying earlier, I could take 2 drinks and then I stop. They just keep going.
Hmm.
2 drinks is better, 4 is great, 6 is wonderful, then they pass out, or they get into these really addictive processes. So the most effective program, and of course it's nowhere near the percentage one would hope, but the most effective program has been Alcoholics Anonymous. And Alcoholics Anonymous, even though they don't talk about it like this, it's a warrior program. They do the same ritual every time. It's other people, it's asking for help. That's a real warrior move, contrary to our Americanized, skewed warrior image, like Rambo, who's got one pocket knife, has been shot 47 times, but he's single-handedly facing off 17,000 of the enemy. That's complete, total Hollywood. That's not the real deal. The real deal is if you need to ask for help to go beyond your limits. So AA is actually a warriorship program. So you see people learning how to do boundaries, how to not drink, how to start living. And at first it's really, really simple, but it's that act of asking for help that is so powerful and helps a person start moving toward a balancing so that they no longer have to do the addictive processes. So you can see in all of these are dynamically opposed to each other, and thus putting energy in one side helps balance out the other side.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put too, that it's about asking for help because, and I guess we would also call it creating accountability, and especially when you talk about that AA program, it really resonates. We're actually having on a guest we've had before, but specifically for our men's group, we're having on Michael Brody Waite, who is a addict turned 3-time CEO, and he now has all these leadership programs. He works with men and women to really help them embody that king energy, essentially. And it's so much of it is about removing the mask, and that comes with having someone and something to be accountable to. So yeah, it's beautifully put.
I wish we had done the whole call with you just on the archetypes. We have just 2 more questions from our group, and then we'll wrap up with you.
Okay.
So, why do some therapists seem to point men to look specifically at mother wounds, and then some focusing on father wounds is the important direction to look? So, why do some therapists point towards father and others towards mother?
I obviously can't really answer that without knowing specifically therapists. My knee-jerk reaction is their own owned material, or maybe their owned material.
Yeah.
I really argue for the fact that we're all going to get wounded in childhood. The difference is whether we got consciously wounded or unconsciously wounded, and then the responsibility, however, is ours. It's not the parents'. So some therapists and some schools of therapy tend to be orientated towards certain ways. And so it could be the person's education or their own experience. I'm an equal opportunity person. I think both parents have some negative effects as well as positive effects upon that. What I'm more interested in is what is the developmental process of the childhood that the person went through. How did the developmental things either get done or are missing? And so even with symptoms, I don't work like a therapist does, whereas therapists, particularly psychiatrists, are looking at a symptom for a diagnosis, which is not only how they get paid, but also determines, in the case of psychiatry these days, which drug they're going to give you. Whereas for me, symptoms are simply signposts pointing toward developmental processes. So for example, if you go to a psychiatrist with the most frequent disorder that people show up for, which is anxiety, the first thing they're going to do is pull out a prescription pad and write your prescription for something like Xanax. And that's probably as far as it'll go, because there's not much emphasis on trying to figure out why you're anxious. Whereas for me, anxiety almost always indicates you're inadequately connected to warrior energy, because if you're truly connected to warrior energy, you'll be calm. You won't be full of anxiety. And your life will be less chaotic. If you're organized mostly in love or magician, your life's going to be chaotic and you're going to have a lot of anxiety. Whereas if you have a balance with the sovereign energy and the warrior, and you don't have to give up magician and lover, by the way, but your life will become much more organized. It'll be more centered. It'll be less chaotic, and thus you'll have less anxiety. Now, I don't want to make a blanket statement that there's no such thing as biochemically induced anxiety, but I really haven't seen much of it. Mostly what I see is people who need more adequate connection to warrior. And of course, in our culture, we don't really believe women should be connected to warrior. It's just, to me, crazy. I think we should be teaching young women martial arts when they're in kindergarten. There's no reason that a woman should be as vulnerable as many women feel. And we don't have to demonize that warrior energy in a woman. We can foster it, we can steward it, and a woman doesn't have to give up her femininity to be connected to warrior in a positive way. But that's our image. Usually women who are really connected with warrior, we think of them as not particularly feminine. And some of them, of course, are not, because they're animus dominated. They've allowed their inner masculine to get in the wrong place. But that's kind of our image. So we're very black and white in our thinking. Which I think all people should be initiated into warrior energy.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with me personally, because of that anxiety and panic, all that came out of me. And it certainly was, a lot of it was because I wasn't setting proper boundaries for myself. I was overdoing it in all aspects of my life, really overworking myself, saying yes when I should be saying no. I just didn't have any kind of boundaries set in place. And is maybe a less obvious way that we need to be able to protect ourselves than doing a martial art, of course. But women, I find so many women, especially in my sphere, are overachievers, or they are putting others in front of themselves, or putting their work in front of their own, physical needs or whatever else they might need in their life, and just don't have the boundaries, or even the knowing that they need to be setting boundaries, doesn't even come into play. So that makes a lot of sense, that the warrior is what needs to be looked at there.
Yeah. And I am curious, if I feel that my magician is inflated and I feel that my lover is suppressed, would I try to channel the queen energy most?
Well, I think, ultimately we have to work on all four of these. I'm just saying the fastest way to bring balance to one that's imbalanced is putting energy into the other one, the opposite. So if I've got way too much magician, I may drift off into so much deconstructionism that I become cynical about everything and everybody. Comics, for example, make us all laugh because they're in the magician. They're deconstructing. They're showing us how silly we are. Which is true. But they also can become quite cynical because they're not standing for anything. There's nothing positive. It's just humans are stupid, and that's the end of the story. Whereas if you actually balance that magician out with some of the sovereign energy, you can start to bless us and move toward being a centering force that can bring cosmos out of chaos. Then that makes that magician less cynical, less deconstructed, less overrunning with deconstruction energy. So one of the examples you can see this is in our university settings. Postmodernism is really what's taken over the last half of the 20th century, where you'll learn very quickly, particularly if you're in the humanities, at least I did anyway. I went to university thinking I was supposed to do something, but you very quickly learn that's not, they don't want that. They want you to show how other people who tried to do something are so stupid. Then you get real good accolades. I'm being a little unfair here, but I'm just for the purposes of pointing this out.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always wanted to go to a postmodernist convention and stand up in the middle of it, rather mischievously, I guess, but I'd like to stand up and say, exactly what are you folks for? What are you taking a stand for? You're telling me everything that's wrong, but and that's, some of that's useful, but so you can get too much magician. So moving into that king to try to figure out how you can think about the whole realm, how you can bring order out of chaos will help balance that magician. If you have a repressed lover, very frequently, oddly, maybe moving toward autonomy is part of the situation, which would be the warrior energy to give you the safety to be able to fully express your lover without feeling like you're going to get harmed or hurt or slipping into codependent behaviors and all the other difficulties that come with that. So conversely, if you've got somebody who's just shooting up with warrior energy, they badly need to put some effort and energy into the lover. So this often happens with men who kind of get into a workaholism kind of thing where, they work 70 hours a week and they don't have any time for their children. They don't have any time for their wife. They don't know that their magician's not working. So when they come home, they're still working when they're supposed to be getting into the garden with their lover. So those folks can help balance that warrior out by doing the lover. But ultimately, we need all four of these online. We need all of them regulated and balanced. And if you do that, your relationships will get better, your insights will become better, your boundary setting capability will become better, and you will be much better at creating a sense of cosmos, both within your psyche as well as within your sphere of influence.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Again, I wish we did a whole policy just on the archetypes, but maybe at another time. So our last question: seems the collective considers midlife issues as a negative issue for men. Do you find men going through this tend to push it deep into the bag they're dragging and just ignore the questions within self?
Well, we certainly have a lot of acting out. We call it the midlife crisis because this is mostly what we see. We don't have much awareness that this is a tremendous time of initiation, a tremendous opportunity for change and growth, and even a movement turning toward a more balanced life, particularly in the area of spirituality and psychological growth. So the classic thing is that you came up and your father was an accountant, so he said that's what you should be, and you said, okay, I'll become an accountant, but in fact you had the soul of an artist. But you did it, you got your CPA, you did all the stuff, you did everything society called for, you got married, you had the 2.7 children, you got the golf club membership, the boat in the backyard, and then at 42 everything goes flat. 40, 42. And so you suddenly think, well, my life is just nothing is bringing me happiness. But that 18-year-old secretary that they just hired, wow, man, she lights up my life. And suddenly you're in an affair with an 18-year-old secretary and you decide to move off to New Zealand to become a goat farmer. Not exactly the best way to handle this kind of thing. But without guides, without any cultural understanding, men are just and women too, are left with this. It's not just men. So we see a lot of acting out. We see, the incidence of people buying red Corvettes goes up through the ceiling around this age period. Plastic surgery becomes all vogue, whereas really what's supposed to be happening is us pulling stuff out of the bag, not putting more into it. So if I understand the question correctly, I do think a lot of people try to do what's called regressive restoration of the persona. It's like a computer. If a computer goes haywire, there's a restore button, or at least on some computers, where you hit the restore button and it takes you back to the time period before everything went chaotic. And a lot of people try to do that. So that's actually a rejection of the call to initiation. It's an attempt to go back to how it was, clean it all up, get it all put back together. So there is a significant amount of putting stuff into the bag at midlife, unfortunately, primarily because people just don't know what to do.
What comes from that is there, I mean, we talk about dis-ease being an unalignment inside the body, or body mind at least. What happens when we continue to stuff down the stuff we are needing to look at?
Well, because some people are successful at this, they live the conventional life and they go through the midlife crisis with just more or less a blip and think they had bad cases of indigestion or something. And then they just stay very rigidly controlled in their conventional way of living. For other people, it sets up a real neurosis where there's a real war with oneself, because the higher self, our transpersonal self, is seeking manifestation. It's seeking for us to get bigger. And so it keeps ripping this fabric of our universe to give us the opportunity to get bigger. And we keep interpreting that as disaster. And so we do everything we can to get that put back together, instead of embracing it and saying, okay, I have to figure out a new kind of way of living. I have to figure out a new life. And again, if you have some guides, if you have some people who know about this, they can help you greatly by saying, no, this is, yeah, I know you've had this big loss and I know you're facing great difficulties, but if you work through it and you face the challenges, you'll come out on the other side with a changed sense of self. And then your life can open up. I mean, I'm always hesitant to start telling people all the great things that can happen when you do this, because I don't want to sound like I'm selling something. But truly, if I look back on my own life before I started doing this deep level work, and especially the archetypal work, it's like I'm talking about somebody else. There's no comparison. I cannot imagine what my life would have been like. And I can say that my life is deep and rich and full of meaning. And I've developed the capacity for awe and wonder. And so it's just a very, very different situation than the world and the life and who I was before I did all this work.
Yeah, it makes me think of something we talk about on the podcast a lot, which is thinking from your deathbed head and just putting yourself in that mindset of where you're laying on your deathbed. Do you have regrets because you don't feel you lived a full spectrum life? Do you feel like you didn't get all the juiciness that was offered here because you obstructed yourself in some way? So that is beautiful to hear that your journey is working out well.
Thank you so much for coming on today. I know I said I was, working on this inflated magician, but I think even though this may be that's wanting me to do this, I'm going to book a session or two with you just to try to, because those few moments of talking about the archetypes was so helpful. So I'd love to dig deeper into that with you and really figure out what exercises I can do and things like that. So sounds so magician-like. So it's kind of a catch-22, but
we have actually a really beautiful comment from one of our attendees that says, this is so eye-opening, even for a guy seeing a counselor for a few years. He's been doing that now. So thank you for your information.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think what's different with James is his style is more mentorship, if I'm correct, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So a mentor really, like he said with Robert Moore, is like, it's blessing. They speak into you.
Yeah. And hold that space, that beautiful space. Thank you, James, for coming on the show. And thank you for the work you're putting into this world, not just here today, but just generally. I've, through Jade and through Tom, known so much beauty is coming through that channel on its own. And it's even flowing as deeply as to me, just through that channel alone. So we really appreciate you here and being such a light. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Have
I really
a good rest of your
enjoyed it.
day. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.